Thank you, Senator Pavley, and I appreciate your comments with regard to 20th century system with the need for a 21st century. And we don't really need to reinvent the wheel because other parts of the globe, as you pointed out, Australia, Israel also has seen its population multiply manyfold and its water use remain constant as its rainfall continues to decrease. I think the governor had some water experts from Israel here a month or so ago, and one of the things they had mentioned was that 80% of their agricultural water is reused, and we're at about 20%, so we've got a lot of ways to go. Senator Hancock.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Leno. Just a few comments on this topic, which is such an important central topic to how we use the bond money, and then I do have a couple of short questions. I really agree with my colleagues. I have a great problem with the blanket authority to move money around, especially if there are constraints on that the money has to be encumbered in 18 months, but then in a 10-year period could be shifted around without legislative oversight. And it seems to me that we need to consider either requiring legislative action on requests for bond change, or, as Senator Wolf suggested, looking as we do on the State Allocation Board for school bond funding. When we try to move money out quickly, we look for shovel-ready projects in areas of great and non-controversial need. And of course, there's also emergency items like drinking water in some of our disadvantaged communities. But I hope that we can really do some work on this. And then I really appreciated Senator Leno's comments on long-term thinking. All the indications that I've seen are that our snowpack is going to be greatly diminished. And since most of our coastal cities rely on that snowpack, what are the alternatives? And somebody needs to be thinking about it before it happens. I did want to comment on the revenue issues raised by Senator Nielsen, revenue and accountability. You know, the long-term bind that I find us in is that there are federal rules and regulations about water quality, about oil refinery management, about prison conditions. We see this over and over again in our state. And if we don't act appropriately, we can lose control of our own systems. That's why we have a receiver in our state prisons. That's why there were comments about taking over our water supply regulation from the feds because of the recent news stories about pollutants being allowed to be injected into aquifers from which we might need the water. And what we found is that when the feds take over our regulatory processes, we lose control, and it's very, very, very expensive. So my concern would be that we find, you know, Senator Nielsen talked about the locals having difficulty raising money. I think we need to realize that at the state we have the same 2/3 requirements mostly, and which makes it very difficult to raise money. And then we can find ourselves in these receivership situations. And but I wondered if you had, because we're going to have to look at that long term too, if you had any definitions of public benefits, which you talk about statewide public benefits. And I'm interested in this because we've seen over time a pattern where, generally speaking, coastal communities have voted for bonds. As we say, the money flows inland, often to communities that won't vote for bonds themselves and are therefore high-need areas. So representing coastal communities, I have to say that I do see a situation in which coastal residents are paying for their own local water systems, and then they're also paying again, in their state taxes for money that goes to communities that haven't taxed themselves. Sometimes those are communities that are very poor and can't. Sometimes those communities do tax themselves, and it's just communities that don't believe in pooling our money to buy things together that we can't afford to buy separately. So it does seem important to me that we get statewide benefits out of every dollar from our bonds. And do you have any definition of that?
So we actually, in the report that should have been handed out, and I won't go into all the detail here, we do spend some time laying out our perspective on what a state-level public benefit would be. And I guess maybe just to briefly start, most activities have private benefits. Then there's this concept of, and so when an activity has private benefits, we generally think that the private entities that benefit from it should be supporting that activity. There are cases where maybe you don't have a specifically identified set of beneficiaries. I think one good example of that might be restoration that improves the health of protected species, salmon or something like that, where it's very difficult to say how much each individual Californian benefits.
How much salmon they eat?
perhaps that.
If you could just tell us what page it's on.
And it's on page 5. It starts on page 15 of the report.
Good, because we can work off that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think really in most cases you have activities that provide both public and private benefits, so you want to make sure that the state's bond dollars are going only to support the parts of an activity that have public benefits. So you might think about restoration at, say, Lake Tahoe, where it's an iconic part of the state. There's some state value in protecting it, but there's also the local communities benefit from being around there as well. I think another key factor would be trying to target funds to projects that provide benefits above what would otherwise occur. So, for instance, that might mean not funding activities that meet regulatory requirements. And so if you start to carve out some of the things that we shouldn't be spending funding on, then it helps you narrow down to what we should be spending.
Thank you. I'll be interested in that. And then I wondered if either PPIC or the LAO had ever modeled how we could spend the money to maximize federal funds. And I know federal funds are a small amount, but as pop for the drop or whatever, it does seem to me that we should be, if there are choices, targeting money that will bring the most federal match back to the state. We ought to know before we start making allocations.
The very short answer in terms of modeling that is no. We certainly haven't done that. I can say that as the federal funding, say, for example, from the Army Corps, has been tightening, they have been looking for ways to stretch that money and make it most meaningful. So it opens up, and also in the era of sort of the post-earmark era, it opens up opportunities for California to benefit from the trend toward really thinking about multiple benefits and regional integration and so on. So I think California's heading is going in the right direction for being able to attract some of those funds by pursuing the kinds of things that the legislature and the administrations over the last decade or more have been pushing toward in terms of multiple benefits.
I hope we can look at that as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hancock. So I think that's our questions for our first panel. So I want to thank Ms. Hannock and Mr. Favarini-Shorba for your comprehensive presentations and having all the answers to our questions.
Thank you very much.
So our next panel will include Chair Felicia Marcus of the State Water Board. We have Secretary John Laird of Natural Resources Agency with us, and they'll each be making presentations. And then also with us to answer any questions would be Director Mark Cohen of the Department of Water Resources, as well as Kevin Hunting with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Matt Almy is with the Department of Finance.
Good morning.
Mr. Secretary, would you like to begin?
Sure. Thank you. And I know that we have the answers to some of the questions we've been talking about for an hour and a half, so we're happy to just be able to get here.
You know all the questions.
Oh, we know the questions. Hopefully we'll have the answers. And so let me maybe just at the beginning do a brief overview to try to frame some of the things. And we do have people, in my case, from the Department of Fish and Wildlife and Water to answer questions more in depth. But it is just, one thing is it wasn't really mentioned, the Water Action Plan from a year ago is really the framework under which all this investment has been made. And it was really an administration strategy issued by the Secretaries of EPA, Agriculture and Resources to say basically that an all of the above strategy is necessary to address water issues in California. And so it is storage, but it is recycling. It is conservation as a way of life. It is wetlands restoration. It is more operational efficiency. It is all those things. And at the time it was issued, there was at least one legislative staffer who is not sitting in the room right now who basically said, oh, that's just bones with no meat. And what's been interesting is the last year, the things you've been discussing is the meat on those bones, whether it's the drought declaration that allowed for a very unique operational efficiency between state and federal agencies for running the water system, whether it's the money that Senator Nielsen referred to that got out the door in the drought package for local projects, whether it is the groundwater bill the legislature adopted last year, or whether it's the water bond, which really appropriated money to many of the categories that were described there. And so when you look at the budget proposal of the governor, a lot of people wish to look at it in terms of just the water bond, but the water bond relates back to the Water Action Plan. The drought money refers back to the Water Action Plan. The Prop 1E money goes there, so that really it is in that construct. And just a couple of brief points that sort of came up in the discussion, because there's a lot of question about why flood money wasn't out the door and about what's proposed in the budget. And while the water director will really be prepared to answer questions in depth, just one example is from my time in the legislature, and I was one of the people that worked hard on Prop 1E. And there was a flood control project on the edge of my district that now is in Senator Monning's district, as well as Senator Canellis in the Pajaro area. I did the legislation that authorized the state share. We made sure there was money in the bond that would cover that local project. And for the 10 years since then, the locals have taken the commitment of that state share to be able to negotiate a project, but they can't close on the toughest issue, which is whether to widen the river and take ag land. And they're sitting there flummoxed over how to get to the end, but they can't even have the discussions unless they know the state's made a commitment, the state's ready to do it, and the money is sitting there, and it will go out the door the minute there is an agreement on how to do that project. And when there's flexibility, and the director will go into it much more deeply, it's flexibility to move it from state operations to actual projects. That's the flexibility that is being looked for. It's not the global one that sort of bounced around the room earlier. So that there is a point to it. And when you look at trying to get the 1.1 billion out the door, yes, there's a deadline next year, but you have a letter from 5 agencies. There's at least one sitting here that will talk, providing you get to the public comment agenda item, that basically say it is this little bit of a chicken and the egg, just like the Pajaro project. We are ready to negotiate. We are ready with the local share and other shares. but we need to know the state share is there to close the deal. And so the reason to move the money is for the locals that want the commitment from the state to get to projects and get it out the door. And so that is the very important reason the administration supports doing it as soon as you can, to get to these commitments, because waiting for a year is just another year that the locals can't have a commitment and decide that this money is there for them to negotiate out projects. And then lastly, I think it's important because there are actually different requirements in Prop 1E and the water bond for accountability. Not much, but some. And one of the problems that always exists, it flummoxed me when I was a legislator, it was clearly flummoxing all of you in some of the questions in the discussion, is the water bonds are written. There is a limit on how you can rewrite them. And the desire to basically say, we'd like to add this now. Well, if the bond didn't originally allow that, it is almost impossible to rewrite it that way. That is true in the way the Prop 1E was written on flood control in 2006. So the question is what can you do around what is actually there? And we, as a resources agency, we have a very accomplished bond unit that works on getting the bonds out the door. And we have always established a measure of accountability and transparency that goes beyond what the bonds require, so that there's always the appropriation through the annual budget process that the legislature has. Guidelines are developed with stakeholders and applicants through a public process. Draft solicitation and evaluation guidelines are required to be posted on the website at least 30 days before public meetings. The difference between 1E and the water bond is the water bond also requires at least 3 community meetings at different parts in the state around the different pieces of the water bond. The guidelines are reviewed by the agency, the resources agency, before adoption to make sure they comply with statutes and the bond measures. And then in response, the next piece is really responsive to a lot of the questions that came up early. All this, the guidelines, the solicitations, the awards, the progress of projects, the balances in the allocations are reported to the public through a bond accountability website. For those watching at home, it's bondaccountability.resources.ca.gov. And so this is available as it happens, as it moves through the process, so people can track exactly what's happening. And so actually, when people were asking for this earlier in the hearing, we could give a lot of business to the recycling program of EPA by sending it to you in paper when it's available. But it is available electronically as it's available to us and other people. And if there's a way that we can highlight it for you or make sure that it's included in regular reports, we'd be happy to do it. And then we have program staff that carefully follow every project, receive assurance of progress and/or completion before payments are made. And that's another issue, because people say, why isn't money out the door? It's generally at completion of a lot of these projects. They could be 80% complete. People are saying no money's been spent, but it is once the project is done that the money is reimbursed and it actually gets out the door. And that is another reason why sometimes it appears that money isn't out the door, but people are actually working on the projects, getting close to doing it. And the programs and the grantees are audited by the Department of Finance. So there is that measure of accountability, and I think we would work with you to make sure we can integrate it, if we aren't already, to whatever systems you have or reporting you have, or flag it for individual people. Because I know that we hear from individual legislators on projects, and they are drawn to that process so that they can look and see what's happening in their district and know what's going on. With that, I know you're running late. I'll make those my overview comments and be ready, along with everyone, to answer questions.
Will you be able to stay around for a few minutes?
Yes, I've run somebody into my other commitment.
If not, we go directly to questions to you now, but if you have time, then we'll ask you to be patient and stay with us. Great. Chair Marcus, welcome.
Very much. It's nice to join you. And I want to thank you for your interest in all of this and for the heroic work that was done last year to put this bond on the ballot and get it passed. It is extraordinary that we're going to have this money to spend to do an awful lot of good. It won't do everything that needs to be done, but it is an incredible gift to many people across the state of California, and I just want to thank you for that teamwork and effort. I was asked to cover quite a few things in terms of the water bonds, of the Water Board's activities. I may cut some of it short in the interest of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. As you know, the role of the Water Boards traditionally has been in water quality, administering the water quality side of the house, administering the water rights system, permitting, disputes, conditions, and the like. And as of July 1st last year, we took on the drinking water program from the Department of Public Health, which has been a joy and is going quite well. And it gives us an opportunity to really deal with water from source to tap in a more efficient way, not just when you're talking about recycling, but in finding synergies of having the professionals who've been doing this work out in the field actually in the same organization. And we've already found that synergy, both in terms of both sides of the house have already learned all kinds of things that help us do our jobs better. So thank you for that as well. In administering all these programs, particularly drinking water and water quality, we use a carrot and stick approach. Generally, what gets the headlines is our regulatory and enforcement side, but we actually have a long history of funding programs, and we see that as an equal part of our job. And happily, some of that leads right into what we can do with Proposition 1 to hopefully find some synergies and speed along the lines that Senator Woke was talking about and Mr. Favarini-Sorba responded to. I just have to say, I know you're focusing on how we assist local agencies in particular, and I have to say, as a former recipient of these funds when I ran the LA Public Works Department, I know how important these are to extend even large agencies' ability to do their job and their capacity to invest in infrastructure to protect public health and environmental health in their communities, and it's very important. But I also come with a sensitivity to local agency needs. Some call it prickliness if you're from the state level, but it's really about respect for the folks who are closest to doing this work. And so I believe in working with local agencies to figure out how to get the job done versus assuming that if you're at the state or the federal level, you somehow know better, because I think the opposite tends to be true. We all have our role to play, and focusing on the appropriate role of each and how we can all help the public that we all are sworn to serve is really the right way to go. I even have had the joy of working with the Department of Finance in audits, and it's truly a joy. And over a beer, I'm happy to describe how that went to anyone who's interested.
She's just clearly not under oath.
It was a true joy. So I know they're vigorous, let me just say that. So I was also asked to talk about the scope of the drinking water and infrastructure needs, and Ms. Hannock talked about and gave a look at that. I'll just give you a couple of numbers from US EPA in their Safe Drinking Water Report and their Clean Watershed Needs Survey. These are both from '09 and '08. They saw California's safe drinking water need at $39 billion over the next 20 years, and that would be importantly, $23 billion in transmission and distribution systems. People tend to think just about treatment. We got leaky pipes all over the place, which right now this year we wish we didn't have. Folks are losing 20, 30, 40% of water to leaks. We actually can fund that, which has a direct water supply, not just a water quality benefit, also has a water quality benefit in terms of keeping pipes pressurized, which is very important for keeping pathogens out. Source water development, $2.5 billion, treatment, $7.5 billion, and storage, $5.7 billion, and that's in drinking water systems. On water quality, it's about $30 billion, just a little bit less, and that's $26 billion for wastewater treatment, $3.8 billion for stormwater. I suspect that really should be much higher. People are looking at stormwater differently. And generic non-point pollution, $106 million, and I would say that number is low. Another more meaningful way to look at it, or other than just dollars, are really the need. If you look at water quality alone, in California we have almost 3,000 water bodies listed as impaired and not meeting their beneficial uses, whether that's agriculture, drinking water, fisheries, recreation, or any other beneficial use. And that is a big deal. And normally people don't think about non-point when pondering infrastructure, but if you take just stormwater as an example, particularly you're talking about green infrastructure, as opposed to the infrastructure that shunts our water that we would like to be saving directly out to the ocean, where it actually doesn't help anything. you end up with an enormous infrastructure need in the non-point source arena, just in urban communities, let alone in the agricultural sector. Nutrients are also becoming a huge issue. I know you know from San Francisco Bay that issue has emerged as the gold rush era sediments have stopped coming in to shade the bottom of San Francisco Bay. They're going to have an enormous nutrient issue that they're going to have to deal with, and scientists are focusing on that. And they'll have to be doing some of the treatment they haven't had to do in the past, just as the Sac Regional plant is going to have to be doing that now. And so that's an enormous cost on our wastewater side. Half our streams aren't considered to be in good biological condition. 27% are considered degraded, and the remaining 23% are very degraded, and there's a lot more in that arena. And in the issue closest to my heart, which you've already talked about a bit, many of our residents, and we can quibble about the numbers, don't have access to safe drinking water that meets their standards or that they can afford. Part of it is a disadvantaged community challenge, of course, and we'll talk about that a lot, not just in the course of the bond hearings, but in the decisions that we'll be placing in front of you and you'll be placing in front of yourselves over the course of this year. But it's also partially because of increasingly strict health standards that we've imposed, rightly so, based on looking at it, that are just expensive to treat, both for anthropogenic and non-anthropogenic, naturally occurring sources like arsenic or Chrome-6 in some places. And that's very, very expensive to all communities, not just disadvantaged communities. On top of that, we have new contaminants of emerging concern that we're studying very carefully, whether endocrine disrupting chemicals, whether it's the pharmaceuticals we use, all the caffeine I drink. That's my major contribution to water quality impairment in California, I'm sure, and other chemicals that we are researching right now to look for indicators. When do we have to add yet another layer of treatment, which undoubtedly will be expensive? So these are just huge, huge, huge issues in front of us. And the beauty of Proposition 1 is it gives us more than loan funds to put on the table in a big way, which is going to leverage a lot of really important action for communities. We have a lot of existing and past funding programs. I was going to go through some of them, but in the interest of time, I'll just mention our state revolving loan funds. We have quite a bit in the clean water side of the house, which tends to go for wastewater and recycling. We have a lot on the safe drinking water side of the house now. We've been pretty effective at getting those dollars out the door and repaid, but also using it creatively through loan forgiveness, reduced principal and technical assistance grants, working with disadvantaged communities. I think that's a piece of why folks moved the drinking water program to us. That low interest rate provides a substantial subsidy, which is equal to a 20 or 25% grant on a normal loan or on the kind of loan that folks can get. So it's been an incredibly useful tool, and we'll be relying on that when I turn to Proposition 1 shortly. We have about 40 different funding programs we've had over time. Senator Hancock, there's the Clean Beaches Initiative. That one. Take that one, coastal communities. But also a lot of the state revolving fund and the recycled water money has gone there. We also, one I want to mention is that with the drought, of course, folks have focused more on recycled water, and we've spent a lot of time on that in the past year in terms of, even before the drought, and drought response has been a very high priority for us, high priority for me. At the time, we had the largest proposal for recycling in the nation when I was in LA. Since then, in the 20 years or so I've been gone, Orange County's cleaned our clocks and some other communities, so I'm hoping LA will pick up the pace there. A really important way to extend scarce water resources and get multiple benefits. What we did during this drought period is the Drinking Water Division, when still at the Department of Public Health, finished their indirect potable reuse groundwater replenishment standards. We've always been able to do that, but it's been a case-by-case negotiation with the regional board and the local drinking water office. This time we have a general permit, says if you meet certain standards, you can just enroll and do it. That will vastly expand the capacity for safely replenishing groundwater basins. We also streamlined a substantial amount of our getting recycled water to communities, particularly agriculture, in a general permit that we did for outdoor use, for outdoor irrigation and agriculture, which was important. We did even lower cost funding, 1% funding, that's going to kick $800 million out the door. It's going to yield 150,000 acre feet of additional water within 3 years, and that'll be a year. That's the gift that keeps on giving. Once you build it, you have to operate it, but the capital costs really keep giving for an awfully long time. And we're on track to do the next stages per your legislation that would get us indirect potable reuse surface water augmentation rules out in 2016 that would allow
for sending water through one purple pipe versus lots of purple pipes up to reservoirs where they're going to have some residence time and be retreated, and a feasibility report on direct potable reuse, which is something you really need to be careful about. It's important. Folks want to get there. Many utility managers want to get there tomorrow because they love their pipes and they like the idea of just not having to build any new ones. But then you've got to have a completely fail-safe system because we can't run the risk of anyone getting sick. And so there's a lot going on in recycled water. We have a lot of other programs, but I'll move to Prop 1 in the interest of time, and then we can talk about whatever you'd like. We're responsible for allocating a number of buckets of the Prop 1 funding, all terrific. $260 million for safe and affordable drinking water programs targeted at small disadvantaged communities. $260 million also for wastewater treatment projects targeted at small disadvantaged communities. $625 million out of the total of $725 million in Prop 1 for recycled water projects. Department of Water Resources gets $100 million for desal. We get $200 million for multi-benefit stormwater projects. That's not just doing another stormwater pipe. That's actually multiple benefits where you're getting flood control, water supply, water quality, greening, some combination of those in one project, which I, again, from a local level, think is a smarter way to spend local dollars where you get more. This is bang for the buck, not pop for the drop, I guess. But you're also getting, it's pop for the drop and bang for the buck. Yeah, there you go. It's a twofer. And then we have $800 million out of a total of $900 million to prevent or clean up groundwater contamination, and DWR gets another $100 million of that for the groundwater sustainability actions. These are going to be critical for furthering the water action plan. I'm glad that Secretary Laird went first, because when I was going first, I was going to talk about the water action plan, and then he's always very good about it. It is the long-term strategy for dealing with that loss of snowpack. It's looking, I don't care if it's 20, 30, 40 years into the future and knowing we're going to be in a world of hurt in California. And instead of arguing about which one thing will solve it, whether it's storage, some people will say it's all storage or it's all conservation or it's all recycling. And I say to that, nonsense. It's all of the above, and we don't have a moment to waste. We need it all. And so that's what you all approved in the bond, and it's wonderful.